Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. On this very interesting episode on the Cold War tactics, I'm going to be talking about something very deep. It's going to be telling us some comparatives from history. They say history repeats itself, and the recent events actually tell us history is actually repeating itself. We need to understand these things because if you actually saw my last night's discussion, where I'm talking about can we trust the Western moves against China and what do we see with regards to what's happening in that particular region. Remember, there is a lot of history that we don't know about the tactics of hegemony and the tactics of global control, which lies with the West even now. I'm not against the West. I'm just wanting to protect the interest of India by knowing the history of a lot of issues that actually happened around this particular region so that we can protect ourselves. Knowledge of history is important as we should not and must not repeat it. Thank you so much for joining me. For people who are joining today and who are going to be seeing the show later on, it's always a pleasure coming up with new subjects and stuff like that. As I said, this is going to be an action-packed week. I've got some very interesting shows with some new guests lined up. So stay tuned. And for that, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel. If you haven't, please do touch that subscribe button and touch that like button just very gently so that this particular video reaches a large number of audience. I'm proud to say that DevTalks has been doing pretty well in the past some time. We've crossed 10,000, and I think by tonight we will also cross 12,000 followers. And that's something which is going to be interesting because as we grow as a community, I think more strategic discussions could be done. As I was saying, please do like, subscribe, and yes, if you can, please do help out the DevTalks efforts. There is a QR code right here which will help you take you directly to my page. And of course, you can also become a member or send us super stickers or super chats. As usual, guys, I have, so I've been doing some research which has actually told me some similarities of history as to what exactly is happening in the world. We need to find out what are the stories behind that, and those things only come out when stuff gets declassified. So there's certain things that got declassified recently, and which is actually telling me what happened in those days when the Soviet Union actually invaded into Afghanistan. Is it similar to the story in Ukraine today, or is there something totally different and I'm missing my mark? I hope I do, but I don't think so. Let's get into the presentation, guys, and so that we can look at some evidences that I've been able to garner for you. Sorry, let me just keep it this way it was. So that, yeah, most of you, I don't want you to, my face is not the most important thing. The presentation is. Let's get into it. So I asked the question, did USA push the Soviets into Afghanistan like Russia into Ukraine? Now before I get into this, let's look at the common narrative. The common narrative says that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to hit to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, and of course to have a strong point towards the oil supplying regions of the world. I want to break that thing down and actually understand whether that is the case. Oil supplying regions of the world is, of course, the Middle East or West Asia, as should be called, which actually brings us to a question when we take these two little things to a point which we will discuss right at the end of the show. So stay tuned, where I will break down this particular narrative, which was, by the way, pushed across by the Pakistanis quite a bit. And that's something we need to understand. Through this talk, I will also tell you how Pakistan gained a lot of relevance with regards to the West and what was happening in Afghanistan. It was like the stopover point before Afghanistan in two wars that Afghanistan has gone through. We need to understand this entire loophole and need to see what's exactly happening. The Cold War, of course, was fought between, not fought, but was between the USA and the Soviet Union. It was basically a contest of dominance, right? Influence spheres. People wanted that my influence should be there more across the world. It was touted as a battle between democracies and a thought, communism. And communism, of course, we all know, has been a problem for the world for a long time. And the Soviet Russia was a hardcore communist state. Uh, as the name indicates, it really didn't fall into a war, a direct war between the US and the Soviet Union, although their forces have come into contact during various different proxy wars. Underline word, guys. Proxy wars that were fought in Vietnam, in Korea, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and probably today as well in Ukraine, although Soviet Union does not exist anymore. But let's go forward. The US government aimed to secure and expand its own sphere of influence while curtailing Soviet power. This strategy was known as the policy of containment and can be traced back to a lengthy 1946 telegram written by George F. Kennan, a Foreign Service officer at the US Embassy in Moscow. These are the Karen telegrams. We are very, very critical to understand the scenario at that time. These are open in the public domain. If you guys want to actually get into it, you can. Now, this policy of containment of the Soviet Union, as I said, was to curtail the influence of the Soviet Union going beyond its little acceptable sphere of influence at that time. The Americans had said, okay, yaar, itna we will accept, iske aage we will not accept. On the 4th of January 1980, President Jimmy Carter, who was the president during the time of the Afghan invasion, delivered an address concerning the Soviet Union's December invasion of Afghanistan. And he said, and I quote, massive Soviet military forces have invaded a small, non aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan. At the face value, it was true. The Soviet Union did bring in forces and did what they did. Now, this particular invasion triggered something, triggered a word called the Mujahideen, which we all know, and we all know what actually happened. So, via Pakistan, a lot of the funding of the Mujahideen had started during the days of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, General Ziaul Haq of Pakistan stood there in front of the Americans and said, Sir, I am in your service, sir. As a matter of fact, I've also covered this is one of the miracles of Pakistan's survival. Pakistan was pretty much dead at that time in terms of economics and everything like that. Post the 1971 war, this particular invasion and this move made by the Soviet Union brought their heads out of water and kept them there till the time, of course, the next Afghanistan war took place in 2001, post the 9/11 attacks. That's it was one of the most expensive and long-lasting covert operations ever undertaken by the U.S. government, and I'm talking about those days. Of course, today Ukraine takes the cake. Uh, it began with about $60 million per year from 1980. Mark this word, okay? 1980 official records. We look at what the other records also say to 85, and which rose to $470 million in 86 and reached $630 million per year from 1987 to 1989. हमने पाकिस्तानियों के बारे में बहुत सुना था जो बोलते थे ना कंटेनरों में डॉलर आते थे. And these were the days when they saw the dollars coming in containers. Their economy was booming. They had foreign exchange reserves. They had the works, their best of weapons and everything like that. So Pakistanis kind of juiced this particular opportunity for their own this thing. But I digress. So this is what actually was done, and it was, I'm talking about a document which has been written just after the Afghanistan war as a this thing. So I've pulled out a lot of this material, guys, from the CIA archives, the National Archives of the United States. So I'm not talking through my own mind. This is stuff which has come out from the CIA and the National Archives of the USA. It says the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Robert Gates, the man is still around and he talks quite a bit about various different subjects, including Ukraine, revealed in his memoirs that the US government actually began funding the Mujahideen in July 1979, 6 months before the invasion. Now, when we look at the consumption or the expenses that the USA has done, it starts from 1980. As a matter of fact, which is clearly said by Robert Gates in his memoirs, that the approval and the beginning of the monetary tranche that went into supporting the Mujahideen through Pakistan, of course, started in July 1979. Now, one must say, यार 6 महीने पहले क्या होगा यार इतना क्या है and this and that and all that. This is something which is there today, and as a matter of fact, a lot many people believe today that a lot of the funding actually started by about 76. Now, of course, when you go through CIA archives, a lot of things are blackened out. If you guys want this particular document, let me know. I'll give it to you. A lot of things are blackened out, so you really can't see what was written there. But the common belief amongst a lot of historians, analysts say that 1976 onwards, the Afghans were being, funded with a certain amount of money through via Pakistan. Now, 6 months before the invasion is interesting because when you compare that to Ukraine again, 6 to 7 years before the before the Russian invasion actually happened in Ukraine, after 2015 and 16 onwards, the USA was arming up Ukraine for this particular war. So there is some sort of a similarity right at the opening. In a 1998 interview with the French newspaper Nouvel Observateur, former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and guys, this gentleman has written a book called The Great Chessboard. It's a beautiful book. You have to put yourself in the mindset of 1970s and 80s to read this particular book because he's written it as current affairs. Of course, it's old today. He talks about Ukraine. He talks about a whole lot of other things. And this was one of the guy actually who said that the Ukrainian borders don't make sense. He had gone up to his president and said, "Listen, this is after the break of the Soviet Union. He had said these borders don't make sense. There's gonna be a war." But of course, he was not heard, and there is a war today. He was a smart guy, of course, bent towards U.S. hegemony. Fair enough. He was a U.S. citizen. There's nothing wrong in that. But this is what he said. He said that he admitted that the covert aid of to the Mujahideen by the US government knowingly increased the probability that the Soviets would invade Afghanistan. This is the national security advisor of that time. And I'm going to repeat this. The covert aid to the Mujahideen, the US government provided, Mujahideen and certain other factions, which I will tell you, knowingly increased the probability of the Soviets invading Afghanistan. So, did they push them into it or not? Something we can see. This is an original of that interview. Of course, it's in French, but I just wanted to put it across just as a thing that these things are around and we need to kind of search them. Now, who wanted the war? Brzezinski has, enthusiastically defended his decision, saying that the secret operation was a great idea. And I'm quoting him here. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. We now had the opportunity of giving to the USSR its own Vietnam War. His words, not mine. Henry Kissinger, of course, the man is still alive today and yakking yak away. As a matter of fact, Henry Kissinger is the architect of the US China relations. Henry Kissinger is the architect of bringing Pakistan as a non NATO ally. Henry Kissinger is also one of the architects of the current issue in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, in the World Economic Forum last year, he said that, this war needs to stop within 2, 3 months, otherwise, it's going to be terrible circumstances and this and that. I think he got a little wrapped from the establishment, and this time he said, no, 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 we need to support Ukraine as much as we want to. Now, he's a guy who runs sort of a think tank, advisory board, which advises various different governments on geopolitical issues, mainly the US government, of course, and he's paid by them. So I guess he got a little bit of a and said, boss, correct your line. coming back to what he said around this, and now this is a conversation that he had with the Shah of Iran on the 24th of July 1973, right? And when I say figure two, that's the figure two in my presentation, uh, where he said, and let me just take you to the declassified CIA document that I was able to access. This document was written on the 24th of July 1973. The meeting was between 5 p.m. to 6:40 p.m. The place was the Shah's reception room at the Blair House. Okay, so this was in the US itself. This document was declassified on the 7th of July 2009. Right, it was classified by Henry Kissinger, and then it was declassified, and so a whole lot of details are there. This is again an example of the kind of research I've done for this particular thing. So it says that our strategy has been to create an environment within which the Soviets will be forced to take hostile acts if they do from a peaceful base as possible. Our hope is to put them at a psychological disadvantage in doing this. Now and again, when you arm someone, right, and you are now telling them that we want to kind of push them and force them into a hostile act towards Afghanistan, right? This is something which is there. Of course, the conversation is, your discussion this morning with the president, a whole lot of a thing. But this is the important part. And then there's another line that he actually said, which is again where I point the arrow. I want to point that out to you and read that out to you. He says, uh, again, the conversation above is about Tehran, Iran issues, Saudi Arabia, a whole lot of other things. Here he says we are trying to checkmate the Soviet influence wherever it appears and to exhaust them in any adventure that they may pursue. Okay? We want to create a frame of mind in the Politburo that is tired of costly activities in the Middle East which do not produce results. We want to do this without confronting them, and we want them to simply recognize that they pay a price for this kind of policy. All right? Hidden between the lines is something that we are also seeing happening today in Ukraine. And I'm going to show you more evidence to actually support what I'm trying to say. So what did the US want to do? The US wanted to put the Soviets into a conundrum in one of their weak spots so that they get involved with a war and becomes more expensive. Let's go back to the times of the 70s and the 80s. Of course, a lot of changes around the world. Vietnam War had just gotten over. The Soviet Union and the US was in some conversations about some arms reduction and stuff like that. But every decade brought about a certain amount of escalation, and then there would be de-escalation. By the 70s and the 80s, the standard of living within the Soviet Union had become decently okay. And I'm talking about the main cities and stuff like that. They were decently okay. Okay, so it wasn't as what we've seen in the documentaries. People had food to eat, people had jobs. There was 100% literacy rate and about 99% employment. People had jobs, people had this thing, that thing, and the other. So that's why if you go back to these old Soviet countries and you ask them whether their lives were good, a lot of them say yes, our lives were actually better than what they are today. They used to get pensions, they used to get a whole lot of other things during those days. So they actually enjoyed whatever it is. They liked it, they liked it. Fair enough. There's no two debates about it. Now, what was happening in Afghanistan during this time? Afghanistan was ruled by a king called Muhammad Zahir Shah from 1933 to 1973 until in July he was kind of cooled off by his cousin Muhammad Dawood Khan, who declared uh, Afghanistan to be a republic, and he became the first president. Initially, he kind of fixed up with the Soviets, uh, Parchamis, and there were two kind of clans within Afghanistan, within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. So that's the party that he had created. The Parchamis were basically, you know, urban people. They were a little more well-to-do than the normal this thing. The photographs of the freedom in Afghanistan that we see even today in the 1970s Afghanistan. If you just Google, you'll be able to get some nice photographs. Uh, And there was the Khalaq, which were a little more, rural, little more traditional sort of people. And they were these were the two fractions within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Now, Daud realized, yeah, Soviet Union mein itna paisa nahi hai. He will miss out on the opportunity to get a lot of funding. He said, yeah, if I go completely Soviet, I'm not going to get that much funding because Russia is not, I mean, USSR was not giving out the kind of funding that the West gave at that time. So he kind of slowly started distancing himself from the Parchamis, which were predominantly Soviet backed, and secured some financial assistance from anti-Soviet countries such as Iran, which was of course at that time. Remember, the Iranian Revolution had not happened uh, in 73, 74. Uh, he went towards Afghanistan. He went towards Saudi Arabia, and by 75 he had got these things sorted out, and he was getting some funding within him. Now, this, of course, was not very liked by the Parchamis, who were the larger faction within the setup of Afghanistan. They were, of course, as I said, they were urban, they were rich, so they wanted to control the country, but they were associated with the Soviet Union. Members of the PDPA assassinated Daud, and this particular thing was done by the Khalaq tribes, right? So the changes that he was trying to bring in and this and that were not acceptable to him, and of course a lot of small little politics that was taking place at that particular point of time. If I get into that entire thing, it's a long, amazing story. As a matter of fact, the descent of Afghanistan, as I would like to call it. Now, when while establishing this communist democratic Republic of Pakistan, of Afghanistan, when he got assassinated, Nur Muhammad Taraki actually took over, and I said Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was formed. The PDPA lacked a lot of legitimacy amongst the majority of Afghans because they didn't know what the hell was this communism. ये कहाँ से आ गया यार? You know, they were different kind of people. They said we fought enough. Britishers से झगड़ा हो गया, ये हो गया, वो हो गया. अभी छोड़ दो यार. Let us just live our lives. Now they also, please understand, these were Islamic nations. Communism was more or less a atheist sort of a ideology. It didn't set well with them. So the PDPA was not very legitimate within the eyes of the common Afghan. Now, as because of that, opposition started growing in, and summer 1990, that's 1979, there was a political strife that started in within Afghanistan between him and his party comrade Hafizullah Amin. Now, by September 1979, Amin had thrown out this guy, Taraki, and established power. Hafizullah Amin, incidentally, was directly or indirectly supported by the US. Now, in 1979, summer, July, the funds from the US started coming in, and these secret funds were directed towards this Taraki regime, and basically it created a certain momentum within Afghanistan, right? Civil unrest, little here and there. You know what I'm talking about in those parts of the world, as what we are seeing in Pakistan today. Of course, the situation is different, but the situation on the ground pretty much is the same. It was a little worse than what it is in Pakistan. Now, a lot of unrest started happening. People started picking up arms. There was killings and tortures and this and that and the other. By the end of 1979, now, of course, since the Soviet Union was still backing the communist regime there, Yuri Andropov said, "Yeah, boss, we need to act decisively to replace this Amin character and to shore up this Afghan communism." Now, why you would say, "Yeah, why is the Soviet Union interested in this?" Why is the Soviet Union interested in this? Is because, please understand, Soviet Union was bordering Afghanistan. These Central Asian republics at that time were parts of the Soviet Union. So if this thing exploded, the Soviets were worried about Islamic, influence, extreme Islamic influence coming into the Central Asian states as well. So there's a bit of a connection, and which we see even today. As a matter of fact, when Afghanistan exploded, all of us were like, "Oops, what's going to happen?" December 1979, the Soviet military launched a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan, assassinating Amin and installing a new government under the leadership of Babrak Karamal. Again, as a lot of the Westerners would like to call him, a Soviet stooge. Now look at this. I'm going to stop here for a minute. Look at this with the history of Ukraine. The Americans went in 2014. Victoria Nuland and a whole lot of other things. They had a coup which was known as the Color Revolution, the Maidan protest as they call it. The then government of Yanukovych was thrown out. He was a democratically elected leader, one of the only ones that Ukraine has ever had. He was elected, and Yanukovych was thrown out. Viktor Poroshenko was put back into his shape. Now, Poroshenko, as per some leaked audios, was Nuland's man, right? So she had said, Poro is my boy, put him. And these were leaked audios that are roaming around the place. I can't personally verify it, but this is what exactly was the case. Now, if you compare both of them, a coup started the downgrade, a coup started the downgrade in both the countries, right? Something we need to understand. And Raghunandan, you've asked a very interesting question. And the reason I'm doing this talk is to tell you the power of a narrative. A narrative was built across, incidents were created in the target country, which led another country to invade to protect its own interest, protect its own self. This is something in India we need to understand. We are a vulnerable bunch of people with thousands and thousands of fault lines. Each one of those fault lines can be used against us to create narratives which would make us do certain things that we probably wouldn't do if our heads were in the right direction. That's the reason why I'm getting doing this particular discussion, right? Let's get back to this. During the period leading up to December, the US government did not expect the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. They had said, yeah, we are also funneling some aid, say some proxy shoxy. They'll also sell some proxy shoxy, and another small little proxy war will, or something like that, will start. The US aid funneled to the Afghan rebels. Now, read this very carefully, okay? Again, a CIA declassified document which says that the USA aid funneled to the Afghan rebels was not intended to prepare the insurgents for an impending Soviet attack, but rather to heighten tensions on the ground in order to draw the Soviets into Afghanistan. Interesting, right? When we look at the current history of Ukraine, that's exactly what was happening, because the Ukrainians used to keep on doing stuff into Donbass. They signed these Minsk agreements, and this and that, and that all went to the dump basket. When the Ukrainians started doing what they did, the Russians had to go up and do what they are doing right now. The potential of expansion of Soviet influence in the Middle East, which remained a region of utmost strategic importance due to its central location between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and ये सब central location हटा दो भाई. Bottom line, rich oil reserves. As we've done these sessions with General Narayanan, where he's very clearly told us a lot of the wars were basically oil wars, most of them that were fought by especially the US. So, rich oil reserves, the US wanted to protect its hegemony over the Middle East, get the Soviet Union. If they're able to do the deals with the Middle East, there's going to be problems. Today, exactly again, what we see is we need to also understand what are we seeing today. We're seeing Russia and Saudi Arabia getting together. We see China and Saudi Arabia getting together. India and Saudi Arabia, of course, has had a long history. We need to understand this and put this into context with the history of that time, and you will find a lot of similarities coming across. We'll come towards the end of the show and kind of see what we have to say. Was American oil actually that vulnerable? During the 1950s, the US government, at 47, 48, I think, Roosevelt actually, not Roosevelt, Harry Truman and Eisenhower, both these guys successful, negotiations with the Saudi Arabia, and they were able to establish a certain amount of hegemonic control over the oil trade, which is known as the petrodollar, right? So they had that kind of a control. In 1950s, the US government was eager to maintain access to valuable Darhan Air Base located in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which had come to the US control in 1945 and consequently in 19 57, President Eisenhower invited the king south to Washington, where he promised significant military and economic support to the king in return for the permission to occupy Darahan. Now, it is very interesting that they were afraid of the Soviets coming this way, but they themselves were quite well entrenched in that particular region, right? So we need to understand that. Okay, let's move forward. During the 1950s, at the airbase of Darahan, which remained in US control till 1962 and again 91 to 2001. This is the time of the Iraq wars, Desert Storm, and all that stuff, when the largest US military base in the Eastern Hemisphere and was therefore a vital component of the US military dominance in the Middle East and East Asia generally. A lot of people say, यार 2001 में तो चले गए मतलब क्या? 2001 में they went off and they've got the largest base in the Middle East in Qatar. So they're still there. They've got a good presence around in that particular region. We need to understand this. Okay. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, coupled with the humiliation of November 1979, Iran hostage crisis. Remember this, guys. Look at 1979. Iran flipped off from the US's fold. Why? Ayatollah Khamenei came in. There was a revolution. The the hardliners took power in Iran. The Shah was thrown out, and the US embassy was sieged. Now, this is something that you must also look at very carefully again from the eyes of the 1970s, because the US had also got trashed in the Vietnam War, right? You had USA getting thrashed in the Vietnam War, losing Iran, and pushing the Soviets into a war in Afghanistan. Ki bhai, we've taken a beat now, you bloody get inside somewhere so that you are occupied with that particular place. Let's turn the clock a little forward and see what happened today. 2021. What did the Americans do? They left Afghanistan. Seems like a similar defeat. A lot of us have actually compared the American withdrawal from Afghanistan as a very clear sign of defeat and tail between the legs and running away sort of a thing. Same thing in Vietnam as well. So it made it seem as though Washington was on the defensive and everywhere Moscow was on a roll. So Afghanistan was that retribution. Listen, we went through a lot of nonsense. Now you bloody start going through nonsense. This was a very crude way of putting across their thought process. Apart from this, they worked on on Pakistan and Iran as a counter. Right? Iran flipped in 1979, as I told you, and Pakistan they had to control, because if they had lost Pakistan, the entire region would have destabilized for them. And that's something that the Americans always remember. Today, of course, the value of Pakistan is going down. But if the Americans were planning actually to go in to push the Soviets into Afghanistan, they would have needed Pakistan. If the Iranian Revolution hadn't happened in 1979, a lot of this aid which went through Pakistan would have actually gone through Afghanistan, through Iran. But look at how things go by. Iranian Revolution happened, this war happened, and then you've got Pakistan saying, I'm here, sir, your loyal soldier. This was also a time when jihad, of course, jihad has been used as a tool since a long time, but modern jihad, if I may say so, foreign policy makers in the US, they realized, yeah, political Islam could be used as a tool against communism. As I said, communism was this atheist, godless, so-called, whatever. And Islamic, of course, they're God-fearing and, they're religious people. So they said this political Islam thing could be used. Till that time, political Islam was pretty much present in countries like India, where the division of India happened and this and that, and there was a whole lot of tamasha. It wasn't actually used that well by
by the world till that time. The US government started supporting Sarikat-e-Islam against Sukarno in Indonesia, Jamaat-e-Islami against Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan, and this Jamaat-e-Islami has become a curse for even Pakistan as well as in Bangladesh. And the Muslim Brotherhood against Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He was a part of the non-aligned movement. These guys wanted to talk about a different currency and he got taken out. During the 1980s, the US government and its allies fervently depicted the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a war against Islam, political Islam. The Soviets had nothing to do with Islam, but that's the narrative that was created. Very interesting and very, very important to understand. The entire war, as we've learnt it through history, has been based on a certain narrative, which is what we see in Ukraine today. For example, the silliest and the most stupidest narrative that you hear is that the Russians want to destroy Ukraine and start taking over the rest of the old, create the old Soviet Union, take over the Baltics and this and that and the other things. And on the second breath, they actually say that the Russians are so stupid they're not able to move 2 kilometers a day. How ironical and how completely diabolically opposite statements. But that's how it is. They realized even then that you can create a narrative from with regards to God. The people who follow Islam are their followers. So they wanted to use that entire strength and that entire fire within the Islamic people in Afghanistan and, of course, the general area of the world to make them against the Soviet Union. Amongst the recruits who traveled to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Afghan war was Abdullah Azam, a scholar from Palestine. I'm sure you've read the next name. Osama bin Laden, the son of a Saudi Arabian billionaire originally from Yemen. In 1984, Azam and bin Laden founded the Office of Services, a recruitment and support for Mujahideen soldiers. After Azam's death in 1989, bin Laden merged this organization with other Islamic extremist groups, creating the Al Qaeda. The Al Qaeda, literally translated, means base, the root of the organization. Interesting. These guys were all funded. So, by whom we know? So, who created the Al Qaeda? I'd leave that to you to answer that question. Who created the Al Qaeda and who got hit by the Al Qaeda after that? Now, my favorite word, narrative versus the reality. Couple of slides more, guys, where I'm going to be able to threadbare this entire thing in front of you. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the US government was determined to maintain Mujahideen resistance to prevent a Soviet victory. Pretty simple. Soviet annexation of Afghanistan would have allowed Moscow to come dangerously close to the Middle East and Eastern oil fields and to its age old goal of having access to a warm water port. This is a statement that was told every news channel, BBC, CNN, everybody spoke about this night and day to convince the world that this is what exactly the Soviets want. Let's look at this. The first thing is what he's saying: Middle Eastern oil fields. Now, the Soviet Union, if Russia has enough oil today, I'm sure the Soviet Union had enough oil in those days as well. The oil fields of the Caucasus was still with them. So it's a dichotomy right there. Warm water ports, as a matter of fact, again, if you don't take my word for it, Google search how many warm water ports that the Soviet Union had. They had enough and more. Even now, the Black Sea belongs to Russia in large aspect of it, especially with the Ukraine war, the way it is going. A lot of the Black Sea is going to be controlled by the Russians. That's a warm water port right there for you. What do they need one coming out here for? Something that we need to understand. Of course, the next narrative that was sold is, oh, Afghanistan, when the Soviets have come in, they're in Kabul. Pakistan is just 200 kilometers away from that place. They're going to run through Pakistan and come straight down into the Indian Ocean because they want to capture the port of Gwadar. This was the narrative that was sold in Pakistan to kind of recruit. And this has now become a part of history in terms of the official history of what happened there. While the long term goal was to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, the US government's first aim was to use the conflict to inflict, oh God, I can't believe this is happening again, as much as damage on the Soviet Union as possible. Look at the statement that was given by none other than Defense Secretary of the Americans, Lloyd Austin, who said in Poland at the beginning part of the war that our main aim is to weaken Russia so that it cannot do what it did to Ukraine again. They didn't say that our main aim is for the Ukrainians to win. They said we want to defeat Russia to a point that they don't do this. Now, when we look at what they had said that time as well, the language is exactly the same. While the right, so this is as much as damage as possible, and a lot of efforts were made to intensify the conflict. Right, the Special Coordination Committee, the SCC, which included, aside from President Carter, most of the key figures of the White House, State Department, Defense Department, uh, Joint Chiefs of Staff, National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency, concluded in a meeting, declassified meeting on the 26th of December 1979. The main two things I pulled out, and it said the greatest risk we face is a quick, effective Soviet operation to pacify Afghanistan. This would be extremely costly for our image in the region and to your President Carter's position at home. Our objective then should be to make the operation as costly as possible for the Soviets. Now, in February 1987, CIA published a report estimating that in 1979, the Soviet government had spent over about $15 billion. रिपोर्ट डाल दी भाई 15 बिलियन इन्होंने खर्चा कर दिया है एंड दे आर नॉट यूजलेस है ये है वो सेम थिंग दैट वी हियर अबाउट द रशियंस टुडे एंड you know they also did a study and they said if the Soviets hadn't have invaded Afghanistan, just helped Afghanistan, the Soviet Union would have paid up about $3 billion. Today they're paying 15. Look at this, yeah, and all that stuff. Propaganda. However, the report again concedes that the estimate of total costs is likely to be much more higher than low. Right? Okay. It used very high end of estimated aircraft losses and this and that, which is again what we see today. Oh, the Russians have lost 2 lakh soldiers. 2 lakh soldiers. Where have you got this from? Some guy just dreams up a figure and puts it out. They've lost 300 aircraft. Exactly what we are seeing today is happening back then as well. History, guys, repeats itself. We don't remember this history of those times, and that's why we let all this stuff happen to us. And when I say us, I'm meaning the global citizen, right? India, of course, we need to learn our history much better than what we have. There's no question about it. Moving forward and sticking to the point, it appears that the CIA's inflated war estimated total cost in order to represent the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan is potentially, mark the word, potentially more costly than it actually was. So they said, यार ऐसा है जरा थोड़ा सा इधर उधर करते हैं, let's make this to look at, oh, Soviet Union has spent so much money, right? That was the main aim. Again, we see the same thing today. The Soviet leaders continue to express frustration. Of course, there's so much money was going into Afghanistan. Mujahideens were being trained left, right, and center. Pakistani army, as a matter of fact, was fighting. I think yesterday, that demon of a person, Parvez Musharraf, died. And there is an interview where he's very clearly said that his own batchmates, which were there for, they had taken leave from their SSG and gone and fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So the Pakistanis are very heavily invested in all this stuff. Today, the festering boil that we see next to us is being created because of this nonsense. Again, we need to understand this. These kind of issues can be created by the West anywhere because the unaware population and a stupid population, like what we see in Ukraine today, falls for that nonsense and actually destroys itself. So the Soviet leaders continue to express frustration over the protracted war in Afghanistan. This was evident at the Party Congress of February 1986 when Gorbachev referred to this war as a bleeding wound. Again, look at what Putin has said. There's a difficult war. So it's interesting when you look at these two wars separately and you kind of see what are the similarities. The entire narrative is pretty much the same. What did they do? They took out an old book. जरा झाड़ा झूड़ा चिपका दो. They added Twitter, YouTube, ye. Start. Now, this is the National Security Archive of 1979, and I just want to read out a small line. The Soviets, the Soviets will go to some lengths to protect their interests in Afghanistan, probably not to the extent of intervening militarily. This is early 1979. This document tells you what I was telling you before. The Americans didn't realize it, and they armed the Mujahideen just to create tensions. They didn't think that the Russians will come with all guns blazing and go inside. Let me assure you, the invasion was very, very, very special. They had done a brilliant job of it. Later on, what happened was the Russian troops, which are the main troops, were pulled back, and then a lot of these Central Asian countries, which were not had very great armies, they were sent inside to protect this entire thing. Now, how did they do it to Europe? Hmm. On 1980, a memo to Vance S. George, Assistant Secretary of State, European Affairs, explained that several European leaders, British, French, German in particular, were worried that US government would do too much and too fast and publicly pressed them to show solidarity. What are we seeing today? 2 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion, 47 billion, ye billion, wo billion. Americans are running through and giving stuff. Publicly press them to show solidarity. What happened to Germany when it refused to give tanks? They were rumbled all over the place. Public pressure, media narratives, this, that, and the other. The entire ecosystem went behind Germany and said, okay, I'll give you the tanks. Yeah, that's a different story. Now a lot of voices are coming out of Germany and saying, forget it, we're not giving anything. Right? So those days were a little simpler. These aren't. In order to intensify the perceived dangers posed by the Soviets in Afghanistan, President Carter encouraged US and Western allies. I'm going to say this very slowly, okay? Dramatize our concern about Afghanistan. First word, dramatize. Right? Uh, It's amazing that we see this even happening today. Half the stuff that we hear about the Ukraine war from Western sources is all bump. Dramatize. Same old playbook. That's it. You know, they basically said, yeah, we need to find non-communist states. We need to work with non-communist states. Pakistan said, sub, I am non-communist, sub. They banned their communist party, whatever little part they had. A lot of people got thrown out of the country, and this and that and the other. So can you imagine to fight a communist? The communists suffered. Now, this war was also interesting because the US also allowed China to come inside this war. Right? They gave Pakistanis financial assistance, military aid, weapons, ammunition, ye, wo, and the other. They gave diplomatic issues. जो भी इंडिया के साथ उसके चक्कर चल रहे थे, खड़े हो जाते रहने, नहीं हुआ, रुक जाओ, ये वो, and all that stuff, which they even do it today, by the way. Strategic interest, the Chinese saw the Soviet invasion as a threat to its own security. Remember, the Chinese have fought this bloody war in the Sunni River in the east. So they were worried, यार ये क्या कहीं हमारे पे तो नहीं चढ़ जाएंगे बाद में आके, यहाँ पर अफगानिस्तान लेगा, पाकिस्तान लेगा और यहाँ से उधर चढ़ जाएगा. They all knew that India is pretty well very strong with the Soviet Union even in those days. The Chinese also wanted to counterbalance. Chinese said, yeah, we both are big economic as well as uh, communist powers. We need to kind of sustain. Chinese said, the Russians said, but they had a falling out and they wanted to now come into a point of competition. Right? Now, strong partnership with Pakistan, of course, China has that since I think 63, when the Shaskam Valley in Ladakh was given to the Chinese by the Pakistanis to settle out their border disputes. That's one of the only neighbors the Chinese have done it with, by the way. and anti-Soviet sentiment in Russia, which has strained the multiple relationships. China will continue to fester that a little more. Now, the last page, guys. After that, I'm going to spend about 15 minutes taking 10 or 15 minutes taking your questions. The last page says a little bit of a recap. I mentioned to you about coups. Both the coups happened in both the countries where we saw the regime changes taking place, right? And we saw war happening right then. Civil unrest is interesting because Afghanistan was going through civil unrest because of leadership crisis and a whole lot of other things. Civil unrest in terms of Ukraine was happening in the east, in the Donbass region. They've been at war for 7 or 8 years. They've been shelled left, right, and center. So that's something again we see. Aim is not to defeat, but to, sorry for the spelling, hurt the Russians. Okay, Soviets. Today again, Lloyd Austin said, hurt the Russians. They don't say Ukraine needs to win. They say hurt the Russians. Break up Russia. This is the narrative today. US humiliation in Afghanistan is a great example of a comparative to Vietnam. USA ran away, as I said, from Vietnam. USA ran away from Afghanistan. Humiliation, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Create a war for Russia and that side. So he's diverted, start picking on China, as which has already started, so that people will forget all the nonsense that happened in the previous years. Remember, Joe Biden is going for an election next year. So a lot of optics would be very, very critical to kind of ensure that they're able to get the right thing that they want. Right. So let's kind of look at it further. It says Soviets will take over the warm waters. As I've discussed with you, it's all bump. All the deals that they had done in terms of, you look at it, the Minsk Accords. Today, Angela Merkel, this, that, everybody's come out and said, boss, there was, right, we just did it to buy time. Even back in the day, Americans said, no, 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 we're not doing anything in Afghanistan. We have pacts amongst America and Soviet Union that we will not do this to each other. But they did it. Look at what bad consequences that came out of that. Pakistan became a strong country once again, a country that was useless. There was no use. They became important. The Chinese came into the mainframe because they started working with the Americans. The Chinese gave Pakistanis a lot of military aid, by the way. That ranges for helicopters. They built up two tank factories where the T-54s or the T-64s were being manufactured in those days. So the Chinese gave a lot of support to the Pakistanis. Artillery shells, this, that, whole lot of stuff, infrastructure development and factories were set up by the Chinese for the Pakistanis to produce all this stuff and give it to Afghanistan. So the rise of China happened. Who will rise post this fracas in Ukraine? Poland? Really? I don't think so. But anyways, there is going to be some winner. Of course, what we see in Europe today is a devastating earthquake in Turkey and a whole lot. And of course, warnings of a tsunami in northern Syria and Turkish, what do you call the ocean front. But who will get rich and who will get more powerful and who will become the next China within Europe? Something that we'll have to wait and watch. Guys, thank you so much. I hope you kind of enjoyed what I was trying to tell you. I'm going to get into some questions, answer if any questions, comments, or any further analysis of what I explained to you. See, I'm not trying to tell you the history of Afghanistan or anything like that. I am trying to tell you the narrative that got created, which led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The narrative that got created for the Ukraine war, the most democratic, freedom loving people, they're catching their own people, beating them up, ready, removing their trousers and beating them up in the middle of streets. There is no opposition left. There is no free media in that country. Defense minister is getting caught with thousands of dollars right under his bed. There's another guy who got caught buying generators and making money out of it. These are times when Kiev faces missile strikes every week. So the narrative is always created to say, oh, ho, bichara, ye, wo, and all that stuff. But the actuality is totally different. The actuality is more geopolitical rather than care for Afghanistan or Ukraine for that matter. Let me assure you this, and I'm going to say this very clearly on this show. The day Ukraine war becomes unwinnable, the narrative is going to be, we tried, we gave them so much equipment, this, that. They just couldn't do it. Russia is very strong, they're very this, they're very that. And they'll drop Ukraine like a hot potato and walk away. Okay, so let's get into the questions. Like, subscribe. Of course, yes, there is a QR code right here on top. You can support me right there, or you can send us super stickers and super chats. On that note, thank you so much, Naveen. Very generous. Great historical refresher. What are the takeaways for us going forward? That for US. Let me answer this question. Let me get into the second one because I kind of read your question. It's quite extensive to answer. Great historical refresher. What are the takeaways for us going forward? See, yeah, we need to be careful of narratives, right? Because when the media spin comes and hits you, for what? You don't know. We need to be protective of our own interests. All of these countries that have actually got stuck in these narratives, look at European Union today. They do not look at their own national interests. It's crazy that you are trying to cut your nose to spite someone else's face. But that's the whole reality of things. The economy of UK is growing worse than the economy of Russia. UK is not fighting a war, Russia is. You've sanctioned the hell out of Russia. UK is not sanctioned. So the takeaway is that anybody can be a target, and it can be molded across to gain that public perception where you would be required to take certain steps that will be detrimental to your interest. That's my opinion. That for the US, everyone is expendable, and there is definite gains to be had if you become a vassal state, South Korea, Japan. Well, you know, US has a very, very interesting sort of a thing. They always say our country comes first, and that's just about it. So that's, I mean, that's good for them. They've got a large economy, so they're able to actually push their well across. There's no question again. But having said that, I think the current war is going to break that hegemonic hold that the US has in terms of his game within the country. Within the world. It's also interesting that this particular war is going to change the way we look at the entire world. All geopolitical structures that were created have kind of broken up, right? And this is exactly what was seen during 71 war, 79 war in Afghanistan. Of course, it didn't happen as fast as today because today is like everything, the internet of things, everything happens like that. But things took time, and you realize the entire structure of the world changed when some Pakistanis got in touch with these Al Qaeda guys and blew up two or three buildings in the US. So entire geopolitical game right there changed. Uh, Naveen, your second question, thank you so much. Says keeping aside the narrative wars, shouldn't Ukraine take caution from what happened to Afghanistan? Any scenario in which Russia, with a massive nuclear arsenal, can be defeated? Interesting question. Now, Ukraine taking caution from what happened to Afghanistan is something that I think they should have done before they fell into the trap of the US. I don't think they're in the position right now to think. The people probably realize it, but the leadership surely doesn't. Because they're talking about taking back Crimea. They're talking about actually attacking Mother Russia. I mean, it's ridiculous. A massive nuclear state defeat is next to impossible. Any nuclear state defeat is next to impossible because if a state literally breaks down in that aspect, who knows what could happen. And that's, I think, the biggest worry in Pakistan. So one of the reasons that the Pakistanis have actually kept themselves together all this while is because they've been able to kind of put that nuclear gun on their head and said, listen, Pakistani army will say, listen, boss, we are holding the nuclear weapons right now. But what if we've gone and the weapons fall to someone else? Don't ask us after that. Oh, no, 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 yaar, ye pakdo paise. But I think there is a time now where that nuclear bluff is going to be called out from the Pakistanis. Someone once said the Pakistanis shout the slogan "Bhutto zinda hai," but in fact, Zia zinda hai. Every single disease of Pakistani society can be traced right to Ziaul Haq's martial law. Anikesh, to an extent, yes, but the foundation of Pakistan itself had all this stuff enshrined in it. You look at what they did to Bengal when Muhammad Ali Jinnah went there and said, "You all will start speaking in Urdu." He said this in English to a Bengali population. So they've been trying to, do all sorts of stupid things. Uh, Islamism and a whole lot of political Islamism was brought in by Ziaul Haq. There's no question about it. And they opened the doors to a lot of the Wahhabis and a whole lot of other organizations who came inside Pakistan and created good or groups of their own within the country to kind of take stuff forward. And what you're saying is Ziaul Haq, yes, he was the guy who began this stuff. There was stuff happening before also, but officially, he kind of pushed it forward. Oh, sorry, Naveen, I missed one of your questions. Second order impact of weaponization that in the region with rampant corruption. Okay, so incidentally, Naveen, you've asked a question today. Me and my dad were discussing about this. Dad said, "Yaar, kya hai? Afghanistan, USA, these guys left very 10-20 billion dollars worth of weapons in this thing, and all these things are being used against Pakistan today." And I said, Dad, you're worried about 10-20 billion dollars. When you look at the stuff that USA is given to Ukraine, it's close to 100 billion, and this is just US. I don't know, Germans, Italians, French, Polish, yeah, wo, everybody's given. The total of $100 billion worth of weapons are there in Ukraine, whose population today should not be more than what Pakistan has, for a country which is larger than Pakistan, much larger than Pakistan, and at war. Right? Ukraine really needs to think what's happening, because at the end of it, they've got the lowest, what's that called, population, replacement ratio in Europe. Lowest. It's lower than 0.5. So it's terrible. And the impact of weaponization, of course, there are dark websites, and I've covered this in one of my Ukraine video talks. Dark websites are selling openly the weapons that are there, javelins, this, that, everything is there. The Germans have sounded alarms about it. The Swedish have sounded alarms about it. But who's going to listen to them? Because there'll be a call coming from, hey, just shut up. Americans will put a call there and sub, chup, uske baad. But the day is not far. Mark my words, Naveen. This impact, the day it is felt within Europe, everything will change. But having said that, by the time this actually happens, a lot of damage would be done. And I'm sure you're kind of hinting towards that as well. If you want to learn the same concept with acting by Tom Hanks and Om Puri, Beauty of Julia Roberts, refer to Charlie Vince's War. Absolutely. I wanted to do the details of the big picture. Watch Aadi. Thank you so much. But this Charlie Vince's War is an interesting story. There is no question about it. I agree with you. And thank you for your compliment. Yeah. What is the present status of the oil supply of Russia and Europe? Is Europe dictating any price to Russia? I don't think so. Because the Russians had said, you dictate price, I'm not going to sell it to you. Right? There was a report that I read today. I think 175,000 barrels a day was being sent to Europe in the past 2 months from India, from off the Russian oil that comes into India. So there's Russia has Russia. One of the reasons is capable of standing through so many sanctions is because it's an energy supplier, it's a food supplier, right? They've been able to do a lot of these things very, very clearly, and they've been able to leverage that by being nice and polite with people and kind of taking it forward. Please understand, if the Russians were behaving like the American hegemonics, trust me, nobody would have spoken to them. But they're doing it politely and talking to people and stuff like that. People are still saying, and the reality of the Ukraine war is not lost on anyone. We know what the game is. Uh, Naveen, you say from the US perspective, is it necessary to marginalize Russia before the conflict with China escalates, and then pushing Russia into Ukraine war makes sound strategy? Is this fair line of thinking? I would recommend yes. I'd add to it actually. Naveen, you look at both the wars, right? You got the world, you got Russia on the top, and you got China somewhere in the center bottom, center right. Both the wars that are being proposed are on their doorsteps. Whatever you say about the US, Naveen, whatever you say about the US, the wars are at their doorsteps. Taiwan is on China's doorstep. Ukraine is on Russia's doorstep. So they've kind of pushed these both of these guys into a corner. The next most powerful thing was the EU. With the whole sanction war and this and that, those guys are down in the dump. They don't have that kind of power. So your line of thinking is absolutely correct. I'd just like to add the doorstep war thought process. They they destroyed Afghanistan. They're destroying Ukraine. Who is next? India or China? I think it's China at the moment. India is very far away. Uh, it's China at the moment, brother. I can see that happening. Adi, but Daud Shah was a stooge of the Soviet, and Zahir Shah survived until and unless he remains neutral. That's what great game with the Britishers and Durrani of the 19th century with the Soviets. Yes, Daud Shah was not a stooge. He was. I'd say stooge is a little stronger word. I would say notch it down by about three levels, and you'll kind of get with this guy was. But money was not coming in here. They had monetary issues, so they kind of he's this figure out करना क्या है यार कहीं और से पैसे लेने हैं. And that's what he did. The British great game with this entire region has created the problems for the Pakistanis as what we see today, the Durand Line and so on and so forth. So this is a murky history, right? People don't want to talk about it clearly because one, it is old and it is boring. Exactly. Secondly, the point is that a lot of this stuff would be hidden just to keep the certain narrative alive within the public domain. Venki sir, nice to have you with us. US escalation in Ukraine is about diplomacy, not victory, for which it is ramping up support for a escalate to de escalate strategy, which seems to be very difficult to execute, though. Sir, this escalate to de escalate policy is dangerous, and you're doing an escalate to de escalate policy with a nuclear power. I want to say this, and I may sound like a Russia sympathizer when I say this, but I'm going to say this very straight and simple. Imagine if China or Russia builds up a small army in Mexico against the US. What would the US do? The simple answer is Mexico would not exist. Is that the case in Ukraine today? It's not. The Russians have been very deliberate in what they're wanting to do in Ukraine. They were not so deliberate actually when they went into Afghanistan. Let me say that very clearly. They were very deliberate with what they want to do in Ukraine. The first 2 3 months, he thought probably somebody will come and negotiate. Didn't happen. He pulled back, reorganized himself, came back in. Things were difficult. Went back, thought about it, put out a what do you call draft procedure, and they started assimilating large numbers of forces. Now, escalate to de-escalate, sir, has to be of a certain quantum also, right? What Ukrainians are getting is piecemeal. You can't escalate by doing piecemeal. It's not going to happen unless all these tanks come and stand there together. I mean, somebody was joking the other day. These 14-18 challengers that are coming from the US, the UK is a total frontage of 1.5 kilometers. They're fighting a war almost 1,100 kilometers. How is that going to make sense? And the point of escalate to de-escalate is that it's critical. If one thing goes here and there, the chances of a mushroom cloud are much higher. The doomsday clock, they brought it up by 3 more seconds. So we're like 2 seconds from doomsday now. So it's difficult, sir. Escalate to de-escalate is an interesting policy, but it is damn difficult to actually control the level of escalation that your adversary will go through. You blew up his bridge, where the Germans today are saying Russians had no hand in it. You did what you did to him. He's not done any attack within continental USA or at any of his interests. What have you done? You've done all of these things. So there's a bit of a difference, sir. But I agree with you with regards to escalation in Ukraine is about diplomacy and not victory. Absolutely, because it's about the optics rather than diplomacy. I'd like to replace that word. It's about the optics of it. Sole reason that the Ukrainians are still fighting in this dead town called Bakhmut is because when you put out the optics that Bakhmut is fallen, then the West says, yeah, why are we giving his weapons? He's losing ये वो and all that stuff. So weapons रुक जाएंगे, पैसे रुक जाएंगे. So he can't do that. You must also look at it from his angle. Right. USA doesn't have allies and partners. It only uses ones to destroy the nation. We don't know whom is getting funds in India and who is the useful idiot. Well, sir, you're right. Absolutely, there is no question. I don't blame the US. If I was the US, I would be doing the same thing because you want to be the big dog in the game. Yeah, come on. There's nothing wrong in that. Now these all of us are coming up and saying, no, you're not the big dog anymore. And so he's saying, whoa, what the hell? So that'll happen. Thank you, Aadi, for your discussions on current and historical events. They're a class apart. Thank you so much, sir. Shankar Saab says today's topic and coverage was explosive, really. Okay, I would say Mersheimer's level of knowledge from a purely Indian viewpoint. Oh my God, sir, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm really, really humbled. Definitely me, these multiple listening. Good one, Adi, and thanks for sharing. Thank you so much. Trust me, I mean, that's made my day. Of course, history videos are not that. If I would have spoken pure Pakistan today, uh, you would have had a huge crowd and this and that. But history, a lot of people are not interested in because it's boring, and that's the narrative again that has been sold to us in India. History is a boring subject. Don't study it. So we don't know where we came from. How do we know where we got to know? If you don't know where you came from, it's going to be damn difficult for you to decide where to go. After listening to the Cold War tactics, do you think China's balloon is their way of retaliating against recent American deal with Philippines? Instead of meddling with Pakistan, they are poking at the US. So yeah, fair enough. I'll take that, and I'll also put in a little theory. We all could be right, we all could be wrong. Let me put up my theory. So as I said today, in the evening, I was talking to someone, and I said, uh, the reason that the Chinese would have done this is because Blinken is coming across uh, to China to meet these guys. China likes to speak from a position of strength. So when you create chaos within your country, you kind of look weak. When you look weak, they're able to negotiate with you. Exactly what they do to us all the time. Every time something is there, वहां से पीछे से आके ना वो खड़े हो जाएंगे. और these are Chinese tactics. I don't think it has much to do with a whole lot of more things. But these are Chinese tactics that they play with you. As I said again, it tells you a lot. If they have to send a damn balloon over a nuclear silo, tells you what kind of ISR do they have. Internet, you know, uh, their capabilities of information surveillance and ranging is terrible. I don't know that. I'm just making a guess. That's why they need to send this kind of stuff across. I don't know. But the first point that I mentioned is that they wanted to talk to Blinken from a position of strength, and they thought they would pull out what they do with a lot of the developing economies around India. Right. Yes, all cap has been set at $60 per barrel. Yes, you're absolutely correct. Uh, Pakistan is our doorstep. To what? To what? Right. Thanks so much, guys. It is nice to actually come and do this show with you because it is this sort of a historical aspect brings about a whole lot of very very different things because it makes you understand that a lot in our history has happened that we don't understand, we don't know, we don't even want to know. We see the Ukraine war as a one-off instance. I don't look at it like that. I'm telling you, this has happened before and they're doing it again. All they did was jhado the book and move forward. And we see what we see today. We see a completely terrible situation across the world. We see a whole lot of nonsense which is going to take place in terms of changing of geopolitics and stuff like that. I won't call it nonsense, but yeah, a whole lot of things that will take place in terms of geopolitics and this and that and the other. But it will also give us an opportunity to kind of rise. So right, you have a couple of suggestions. People want to listen about military issues as simply for love of the army, but if the shows are in Hindi, you would also make much wider audience. I absolutely agree with you, sir. There are certain shows I'm doing in Hindi, and there are certain shows I'm doing in English. As I said yesterday, one guy, difficult for me to do both the things and a single show two times. Hopefully, if I grow and if you guys help me to reach the point that I'm wanting to, I can probably hire someone who can do a voiceover for me. Till that time, sorry guys, you'll have to thoda sa adjust with me. Okay, Naveen, there's another one. Your balloon point, if that is true, China miscalculated that Blinken's trip would cancel his trip, and similar to miscalculation with India, you look at every time Modi Saab has had to meet Xi Jinping, there's been a small incident somewhere or the other, and that's been the case all through. As far as Blinken is concerned, officially all of them have said, no, 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 there was no confirmation of this visit. We were just talking at the moment. It's not this thing. So Blinken has said we are delayed it. Khatam. The miscalculation of this sort would be happening as well. I think there was a report. I have not been able to read through it, but I came to know that there was a balloon hovering around, Andaman and Nicobar Island some time ago. So they will do all this stuff. Now, as a matter of fact, I completely agree with you when you say similar miscalculation with India, because I think the entire issue that they've created with India is not in their own interest, right? And this is something that me and General Ryan have actually spoken about, and he calls Xi Jinping a complete megalomaniac for kind of getting behind India and trying to, get a little more control over India, because they rose up a sleeping giant. Yesterday, we banned another 236 apps. There's a whole lot of things happening. They come on our border, we thrash them and throw them off. So, probably a similar miscalculation with different results. That's what I want to say, Naveen. Thanks so much, guys. Of course, I'm going to do something whenever I do a solo, I'm going to read you a quote, a short one from uh, from the sutras of the Chanakya Niti, so that we can also keep in touch with our little, not little, but with our extensive culture. This, of course, is going to be based on the Ukraine war. It says, Hiyamanha Sandhi Kurvita. That means the weak must not delay in having a peace treaty with the powerful. A message, if any of you know President Zelensky, I would appreciate you can pass to him so that he can stop this godforsaken war and things would move forward, which I don't think is going to happen. So, anyways, thanks so much for joining me, guys. QR code, like, subscribe. You can become members, send us super stickers. Please do help me grow, spread the word. And I think before I sign off, let's just see where we've reached as far as our score is. Oh, we've crossed 12,000 followers. Thank you so much, all of you guys, for joining in and being a part of this wonderful journey of Deaf Talks, where we all learn together. Till tomorrow night for another interesting show. Jai Hind.